pleasure to have this opportunity to share some of the wisdom of Tibet with you. When we talk about confidence as a subject, it's something that generally we can see has a lot of interest as a way of living with confidence. It's something that people are curious about, you know, what does that mean? And we'll try to look at that from a few perspectives, fundamentally understanding what Tibet has to offer on that. In terms of references, where I've gathered some of the different ideas, because you may be interested in researching this further yourself, I'll just share the main texts that I've used. One that we'll be looking at specifically, The Voice of the Silence, which is a sacred text of ancient Tibet, compiled and translated by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. We'll be looking a little bit at that. I've also, for myself, taken some inspiration from Concentration and Inner Awakening, according to Tibetan Buddhism, by Fernando Schwartz. That's a publication from New Acropolis, so you may be able to find that on our international website. And you may know the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, Sogyal Rinpoche. This was an international bestseller back in the 90s, and explains very clearly a lot of the key ideas in Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. So I drew a lot of concepts from those texts, which I'll be sharing with you today. But to start, if we're going to talk about confidence, let's define it a little bit. What is it that we're talking about? If we look at technical definitions, the Oxford Dictionary definition is the feeling or belief that one can have faith in or rely on someone or something. For the digital age, Wikipedia offers, confidence is a state of being clear-headed, either that a hypothesis or prediction is correct, or that a chosen course of action is the best or most effective. Confidence comes from a Latin word, fidere, which means to trust. Therefore, having self-confidence is having trust in oneself. So this gives us an initial starting point, which I think has some interesting elements about this state of mind, which proposes a certain level of clarity, and that there is an element of faith or trust in what we're doing or where we're going. That's a starting point, and I'll add elements to that from a philosophical perspective to go a little bit deeper. Because often we place a lot of our confidence in external things. How we have been taught to relate to the external world has resulted in that in a lot of cases. But what the ancient teachings of most cultures really, and certainly from Tibet, suggests is that confidence is born of something internal, not related to externals. I say many cultures look at this, and we can see other examples. If we look at the Stoics, for example, not to deviate too much, but just as a reference, because Stoicism is something that's having a big resurgence today and becoming very popular again. It's interesting to see and to correspond, really, because Stoicism is very similar to Buddhism with a Western approach, but the same ideas are very strongly emphasized, which talk about an internal frame of reference that is the basis of our confidence. Our values and principles, that which we identify with as an individual, that which we identify from an internal perspective as being fundamental to us, giving our lives meaning and purpose. So those ideas, values, principles that we identify with, we can describe as our identity, our deepest sense of who we are, a recognition of that which is essential in us, which we understand and express through our values, ideas, principles. So confidence doesn't come from external elements, such as the job, status, possessions, relationships, etc., but rather from knowing ourselves, from knowing who we are as individuals. What is that identity? What are my values? Because if I know who I am, if I know what my values and principles and therefore my priorities are, it enables me to act in the world with a measure of clarity, some certainty, some stability, which we can commonly call confidence. So if we want a philosophical definition of confidence, we can call it a state of mind that empowers us to act in the world with a degree of certainty, trusting in our inner abilities so that we can be authentic and less impacted by external circumstances. Okay, not a bad idea. How do we do that is the question. First of all, we have to understand this idea of inner abilities. What do we mean by that? And why do we have difficulty trusting them? Generally because we're not that experienced or practiced in using them, or we often don't even know that they're there. When I talk about inner abilities, I'm referring to qualities, many of which are in potential, some of which we use, perhaps not consciously, but all of which we can develop. Qualities like courage, generosity, determination, patience, humility. So strengthening our confidence really comes from an inner journey of self-development, of exploration, much more than an external work of developing skills and competencies. Sometimes we think more skills equals more confidence, more diplomas equals more confidence, more external validation equals more confidence. But then we reach a point, a situation where I'm encountering something that I'm not prepared for. I don't have the skill. I didn't have the training. Nobody told me. And now I'm out of my comfort zone. And that's a measure of our confidence, because out of our comfort zone, how do I react? Often we panic, we get defensive, we start to generate excuses. I don't know, I can't, nobody told me, I'm not trained for this. You know, the excuses are varied, but they're all an expression of a defense mechanism, really. Self-confidence comes from being able to face the unknown. It's not about being prepared for everything, because it's not possible. We can't be fully prepared for everything in life. I'm not sure that we can really be fully prepared for anything, because there's always going to be elements of the unexpected. But if I'm confident in myself, if I know myself, even a little bit, then I have inner tools to help me navigate the circumstances calmly. What we're going to explore a little bit together are fundamental keys given in Tibetan teachings to help us understand this inner work a little bit better. And first, if we're going to talk about confidence as a state of mind, it's important to understand a little bit the nature of the mind. We already know from modern psychology that the mind has a dual dimension. This is commonly understood today, but throughout ancient thinking, it was commonly understood as well. We talk about the objective, subjective mind. We talk about unconscious and conscious. We even have in the physical brain, left and right hemisphere. The left side, more analytical, controlling speech and language. The right side is more creative, working with spatial awareness and how things relate to each other. In Tibet, they have a very interesting way of explaining this. They talk about the ordinary mind and the essential mind. Sem is the ordinary mind. Rigpa is the essential nature of the mind. The ordinary mind, Sem, they also call the grasping mind. It's the aspect of the mind that is calculating, cunning, overly reliant on externals, overly invested in other people's perceptions, always projecting outside, and as such, always counting. If I do this, I get that. If I make this effort, I gain this reward. It's the intellect, for want of a better word. It's the rational mind, the analytical ego that separates, divides everything in a bid to understand it, to quantify it. As such, the grasping mind of Sem is pulling everything apart. creates division, puts things in boxes, puts labels on the boxes, puts the boxes in different shelves, separates everything. It's the basis at an instinctive level of our prejudices, our biases, our preferences. The realm of I like, I don't like. And through the filter of the ordinary mind, we're constantly judging on the basis of that criteria. I like, I don't like. I like, it's good. I don't like, it's bad. So it's very subjective. The Tibetans describe it as a flickering candle flame in an open doorway, subjected to the winds of all circumstances. Because it's very unstable. My preferences and being controlled by my preferences make me very subjected to the winds of life. What they're describing really is the ego, the personal ego. And when we identify with the ordinary mind, when our sense of self comes from the ego, our perspective is quite limited. Our sense of self is based on a lot of externals: appearance, profession, perception, how many Instagram followers I have. We also relate to everything on the basis of what's different, how it's different. This sense of otherness is very strong, and it can become quite polarizing. It's me versus you, it's us versus them. It becomes quite tribal, and there's a lot of justification and judgmental thinking. Okay, now that's maybe slamming the ego a little hard. It's important also to understand the ego is not bad. In and of itself, the ego is, well, it's essential. Everyone has one, everyone needs one, because it's a tool, a function of the mind that allows us to analyze, to rationalize, to reason, to organize. But the point is, what the Tibetans are explaining is that it is a tool that has to be mastered, that we have to learn how to use and not be used by. If we identify with the tool, it's as if, in the case of a driver who identifies with their car, and there are people like this who love their car so much it's like a part of them, and they obsess with the car. If anything happens to it, they lose their mind. So we have to be careful not to be possessed by our possessions, and we have to be attentive not to be owned by our ego. It's a part of us, it's essential, and it's a tool. But if we identify with it, we feel that we are the ego. And then we're limited a lot by its perceptions and its instinctive tendencies. The essential mind transcends all this. Rigpa, they describe almost like a sky mind. So Sem is the grasping mind, Rigpa is the sky mind. And already there's a very interesting distinction here in this very poetic description. The ordinary mind is closed and self-protecting. The essential mind is open and all-encompassing. Rigpa is the state of mind that allows us to go beyond the ego's limitations, its biases, its fears, its doubts, and to see things from a more elevated, universal perspective. If Sem is only capable of seeing things in terms of black and white, it functions in a logic of exclusion, that things are this or that, you're with me or against me. Rigpa is our ability to integrate these apparent opposites, to be able to see things as black and white, this and that you can be with me and against me. So it allows us to understand the nuances and the shades of gray that exist between these extremes. It's a state of consciousness that the Tibetans also call the Buddha mind. Buddha referring to a state of enlightenment. For those who maybe aren't familiar with Buddhism in much detail, Buddha was a title more than a name. There was a Buddha, his name was Siddhartha Gautama, but it was a title meaning enlightened one, referring to his state of consciousness. So the experience of the sky mind or Rigpa is compared to this perspective of elevation that is akin to enlightenment or nirvana, if you like. Now, obviously, we're talking about a state of mind that we can't occupy perpetually, unless you're a Buddha, of course. But for the rest of us, it's something that we achieve in fleeting moments. And I'm sure that everyone has had a moment, I would say what I call like a bite-sized nugget of nirvana, a moment of clarity, of this perspective where we can see the wood from the trees. Things are clear. We understand what we need to do. And in that moment, we're calm. We're able to decide better. We're able to act better. But how do we get there? Often after that period, we're not sure. Perhaps it was a confluence of circumstances. It was the ideal condition. It was born out of necessity. We don't really know, and then we struggle to get back to it. So our objective really is to enter into contact with those moments of clarity consciously, more frequently, for longer periods, and without relying on external circumstances, to be able to do it ourselves from within. What that implies is that we need to progressively start to identify more with the inner self rather than the external self. Why is that a challenge? Because, well, what the Tibetans explain, this analogy of the sky mind has another meaning because it's also mostly obscured by clouds. And this is a wonderful analogy for us in Ireland. I mean, right now, it's a good example, at least here in Cork. And most of the time, you know, we could go days nearly almost forgetting the color of the sky because there's just clouds. But has the sky gone anywhere? No, it's still there. The sky is always there. It's simply that we've lost access to it for a moment because of the clouds. And so Rigpa, the sky mind, is much the same. Your higher self is always there. Your consciousness doesn't disappear. Simply, it becomes obscured by the clouds of confusion and uncertainty that are generated by the ordinary mind. So we can choose then to sweep away that inner obscurity so that the light of the inner being can shine through more freely. Again, not something that we can maintain indefinitely, but it's a daily work that we can practice and develop. That is confidence, or brings confidence, let's say. Having the certainty of our inner relationship with ourselves, our highest self, that which is best and most noble in us. You don't need external skills for that relationship. You don't need anyone's permission, external validation or recognition to cultivate this relationship. We're not dependent on anyone to do it for us. The consequence of this inner relationship is a trust in that which is best in us, which leads to the certainty and stability that helps us to be in the world. So confidence, as described philosophically, is about being, not having. What enables us to be is to be ourselves, to channel our identity, that deep essence of who we are, through our actions. Channeled through our actions because it has to be expressed through something, and that's ultimately our behavior, which is a reflection of our actions. If I have a sense of identity, but I don't act according to it, I don't act according to my values, then I'm not being true to myself. And it's difficult to trust myself. So the work is to slowly close the gap between the way I view myself, the ideal self, and the way I actually behave in the world. What do we call this today, generally? To act according to our values, or to be consistent with the way that we think and the way that we act. Authenticity. Isn't it? That's what it is to be authentic, to be coherent and consistent between my values and my actions. We can also say that that's a philosophical definition for ethics. So that ethical authenticity makes us confident, because we're not playing to the gallery anymore. We're not doing things for how it'll look. We do what we feel is right because it corresponds to our values. At least according to our values at that time and according to our best understanding of the circumstances. These are important criteria because nowhere in any of that does it say you have to be perfect or that you have to be right. We can do what we think is right and do it well, and it still may not work out. Does that mean that I lose my confidence, that I lose my sense of identity? It doesn't have to. In fact, I can take that experience as an incredible learning that helps me to strengthen my sense of self-knowledge and identity. The idea of perfection is a trap, really, of SEM, the grasping mind. It's a trap that we tell ourselves to create a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, because nothing's perfect. So if I expect perfection, I'll always be defeated. And if I'm always defeated, then I have the reason not to do it. But nobody's perfect. What everyone is capable of doing is improving. We can gradually perfect ourselves, but being perfect, well, no. In Tibet, there was an ancient tradition of initiatical education, which is a whole subject in itself to really understand well, but basically it means a system of practice that helped the disciple or Lanu, as they were called in Tibet, to enter into a process of self-transformation, to step out of SEM and towards Rigpa, to evolve or elevate beyond the grasping mind and to open up to the sky mind. One of the most sacred texts of Tibet, the Voice of the Silence. Some of you may be familiar with this. Certainly those who attend our classes regularly, we refer to this quite a bit. It's a text that was compiled and translated by 19th century Russian philosopher Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. And it is a compilation that presents many fundamental advices of Tibetan philosophy. The aspect that I'm going to draw on for our purposes is centered around what's called the three halls: the hall of ignorance, the hall of learning, and the hall of wisdom. What this is mapping out for us is a way of understanding the journey of consciousness from the outside in, from external, the external world of perceptions to our internal reality. So it's a guide in many ways of the development of identity and therefore confidence as well. Before we go into specific examples from the text, one other aspect that helps to understand in the development of confidence is what we call convictions. When we talk about inner stability, knowing what our values and priorities are, as we've discussed, all this is another way of talking about developing convictions that we have in life. But that perhaps needs a little bit of clarification, because it's not always something that has the most positive association, convictions. Sometimes they can be perceived as rigid, perhaps fanatical, dogmatic, entrenched ideas. But in reality, a conviction means that we have a certain degree of certainty about an idea because we have lived it. We've taken the idea and we've practiced it, and we understand it because we've experienced it. Not only an intellectual abstraction, but something that I've lived. And because of that experience, I've transformed that idea into a conviction, which is a foundation then for my confidence. The former president of New Acropolis International, Delia Steinberg Guzman, wrote an article about convictions a number of years ago, and I've just taken a couple of definitions from that to help. She wrote that a conviction is a profound psychological, intellectual, and moral commitment that arises from a growing certainty and is based on good reason, evidence, experiences, models, and foundations. That's the first point, which in itself I think is quite instructive, because we're talking about a growing certainty. It's not final, it's not definitive, but it's a deepening of our understanding based on good reason, evidence, experiences. So it's not just fantasy, it's not just speculation. And she goes on to say, convictions are born from the constant exercise of our internal faculties and the gradual transformation of unstable opinions into stable judgments. So again, it's through the exercise of these inner qualities that we've talked about and the transformation of opinions into judgments. And that's a very interesting distinction and something that I'm going to focus on for a moment, because if we think about convictions, what are we transforming? Into a conviction, generally it's an opinion. Because what is an opinion? We can define an opinion as an unverified idea. It's an assumption based on a preconceived conceit, perhaps an element of our conditioning. It can be an inherited way of thinking through our education, through our environment, etc. So we all have opinions. That's fine. Opinions aren't bad. What's interesting to observe in opinions is, to what extent do I question my opinions, if at all? In general, we're happy to challenge other people's opinions, but my own, do I reflect on them? Do I look into them? Or is it something that I simply accept? This is a fundamental part of getting to know ourselves, to ask ourselves, why do I think this way? Is this still valid? Did I inherit this? Do I actually think this way, or am I simply conditioned by the way other people have thought? Now, in challenging my opinions, we don't want to go to an extreme and simply disregard everything that I've ever thought and become a clean slate overnight. No, it's about progressively challenging, questioning my automatic thinking. When I go to that position, my default setting, why? Is it valid? Why do I think that way? And above all, how can I test it in practice? How can I put that idea, that opinion, into practice and see if it holds up? For an example, let's say I have an opinion on justice, fairness, what I deem to be fair. Do I act that way? Do I abide by my own opinions of justice and fairness in my dealings, in my relationships? If I don't, why not? If I do, how does it go? Does my perception of fairness lead to a just outcome? Or does something go off? That helps us to start investigating a little bit inside with our own opinions and ideas and their consequences in the world around us. Because perhaps it's a beautiful idea, but in practice it's not working. Why is that? Or maybe I've just never really thought about it, and now I can see that this isn't actually valid for me anymore. If I put it into practice in a real world situation and I can observe the result, then I can decide, yes, this is good, or actually no, I don't agree with this. This is just a mental habit that I've developed. And if we decide that it's no longer valid, maybe it was once, but it doesn't hold water anymore, then I can divest myself of that assumption. That incorrect opinion is gone, and I can open myself up to discovering something new. I think it's sometimes a mistake or a misnomer that we have about confidence, that being confident means you always know what's going to happen. You always know, you always have a certainty that this is what's going to happen, and it's unquestionable. Or that confident people never doubt themselves. But doubt also, in and of itself, isn't a bad thing. There's a huge strength and confidence in the humility it takes to admit that we don't know something. Because when we admit that, then we can discover something new, something truer, let's say. An absolute truth, I don't know, because absolutes don't really exist, but something that's more true, something that's more in line with who I am. So I can realize that something isn't true without falling apart. And I can trust that having shed that misapprehension, I can now discover something new. There's a little fear there because there's an element of the unknown. I don't know what lies beyond what I'm giving up, but that's the element of trust or faith, if you like, that we believe that we're going to get there. We have to trust that we are progressing. and not out of fear resign ourselves to remain in our comfort, in the comfort of the ideas and opinions that we already have. When we test an opinion then and it holds firm, in practice we see that it's valid and good. That experience gives a whole new dimension, a whole new understanding that's not intellectual. It's no longer speculation. I can say that I've lived this and I've seen the consequences, and I can say that it's good. Good for me and ideally good for others. That's transforming an opinion into a conviction, because now it's not unverified. I've tested it. And that becomes a basis of something I can have confidence in because I know I've done it. But does that mean that a conviction lasts forever? Well, no, because nothing lasts forever. So we also need to re-examine our convictions. This is where the entrenched or dogmatic aspect can come in. If we have a conviction, but we don't renew it, we don't test it again, then it can become a little entrenched, perhaps dogmatic. In reality, it just becomes an opinion again. So it's a constant work, really, of testing through our actions what of my values work and how, explained in the 3 halls in the voice of the silence. The first hall is called the hall of ignorance. It says in the text, "It is the hall in which you live and in which you shall die." Now, that sounds like a bit of a bummer, but what the Tibetans are saying is that we will always remain in a degree of ignorance. And the Greeks, Socrates, for example, would be very clear on the importance of accepting our ignorance. We're never going to fully leave ignorance because we're never going to know everything. But that doesn't mean that we stay there fully. We can step out of ignorance by going through the hall of learning into the third, which is the hall of wisdom. Of the hall of learning, it says, "In it, thy soul will find the blossoms of life, but under every flower a serpent coiled." This is also very interesting. Requires a little bit of translation. There's a warning here through the process of learning to be mindful of the traps of intellectualism. Because when we're stepping out of ignorance, we're discovering beautiful things, inspiring us, we're learning, we fall in love with these beautiful ideas. The risk is that we become paralyzed in that love of ideas, which is, in a way, intellectualism. We get trapped, we do nothing with them. The grasping mind, Sem, in a bid to justify itself, creates a host of illusions, excuses that I can't, I'm not good enough. These negative mantras, these are all in your head, you understand? These self undermining ideas that we have, they're generated by the ego as a defense mechanism so that it doesn't have to change. Because if I convince myself I'm worthless, I can't do it, then I won't try. Or the other extreme, it says, well, I already know, therefore I don't have to do it. They're both expressions of pride, really. One is manifested more typically as pride as we understand it. I'm perfect, I don't need to do this. Or there's the false humility of, I'm useless and I can't do it. In either case, it's the same result. It becomes something that is an excuse so that I can remain in comfort. So these are elements of these serpents coiled under the flowers. We're discovering ideas, but justifications will emerge as well. Or even just intellectualism as a form of accumulation of knowledge without applying it. The world of sterile mental decoration. I have an encyclopedia in my head, but I don't know what to do with it. Because again, it's a form of mental comfort. And the mind is very powerful. The mental world, it's a dimension in itself. And we can think about something so much that we think we've done it. I don't know if you've ever experienced this. You agonize over something, you plan it, you think about it, you roll through the scenarios over and over. You expend so much mental energy on it that it feels like you've actually done something. But in reality, a finger has not been lifted. It's quite interesting because the mind has that ability to convince us that it is self-sufficient and it satisfies itself simply on thinking. but still an action needs to be done. So in the hall of learning, then, there's described 3 fundamental steps: instruction, application, integration. The first stage, instruction, that's in a way the easy part. It's a class, it's a public talk, it's instructions, it's the teachings, it's the books. We learn. What comes next is application, because instruction is based on a system of transmission, the idea that knowledge has to be passed on. But that passing of knowledge alone doesn't do anything, because there's still an application required. Those teachings have to be taken and practiced. I could give you the manual of a computer, and you could read it cover to cover. But then you have to sit down in front of the computer, take it out of the box, plug it in, open it, and use it. So there's always a practice that goes with the instruction. Otherwise, we run the risk of that mental decoration, because we're gathering information, but we're not doing anything with it. Application is applying what I've learned. And the example I always use for this, it's not mine, I was given it many years ago, cooking. The simplest example. I say it like I know what I'm doing, but cooking, no, I'm sorry. Baking in particular, but baking is a beautiful example. You can have recipe books out the wazoo, beautiful books, images, loads of recipes, and they can gather dust on a shelf. You have to take the book, the recipe, and you have to bake. You have to make things. You have to follow the instructions. Then what comes after you've followed the recipe and you bake, you eat. There's integration, because through the process of applying what you've learned, you assimilate those ideas so that they become a part of you. They become a part of your behavior. It's no longer just what the Tibetans have said. It's your understanding of those timeless ideas based on your practice. We make it more subjective and individual, and we digest the ideas. That's how knowledge becomes wisdom. That's how knowledge becomes alive, because if we don't digest, if we don't practice, if we don't make it our own, then it's just speculation. And what we pass on is just speculation. If we integrate, what we pass on is experience, because we can teach from the perspective of our own convictions. And by teach here, I mean simply provide an example. Teaching doesn't mean that everyone has to give a class about what they do, but we can demonstrate through our behavior a way of doing things. That's practical wisdom, and it's most easily translated for me into common sense, because we seem to lack a lot of that today. But in previous generations, even if people weren't very academically educated, there could be a lot of common sense based on the experience of them living their values every day, which is the part we have most difficulty with. In general, application. Why? Because we're afraid of making mistakes. We're afraid of baking, cracking some eggs, making a mess, burning it, putting too much butter, not enough sugar. Above all, then, we're afraid of what people will think. The irrational fear of the ego. What will people say if I make a mistake? What will they think about me if I'm seen to fail? And what do they think? What do they say? More often than not, nothing. They're not even paying attention. They're doing their own thing. But Sem, the grasping mind, positions itself as the center of the universe and assumes that everybody's watching what I'm doing. And even if somebody does have an opinion, it's their opinion. There's not much that we can do about it anyway, so who cares? I know that's easier said than done, but it's illogical for us to fear making mistakes, because there's no other way to learn. If we can't fail, we can't improve. The key to failing is getting back on the horse as many times as we need to, because we will fail. It's inevitable. It's human. There's no judgment in that. It's not a problem. In fact, it's necessary, because if I can fail, I can get back up. Again, I think it's a certain misnomer that we have, that confident people never fail. And it's true that failing in and of itself doesn't make us confident, but the resilience and determination to pick ourselves up as many times as we need to and to continue, that makes us confident. With that confidence, we can face new challenges without fearing making mistakes, because we know that even if we do make a mistake, I have the inner capacity to learn from it and to continue. The third hall, of course, then is wisdom, which we've talked about in that practical wisdom, because having an element of wisdom, it again isn't reaching nirvana. We're not wise, but we have elements of wisdom. And this is something to understand in the 3 halls. We occupy all 3. We don't live our lives only in ignorance. There is a process of learning, and we all do have a modicum of personal wisdom. Yes, because everyone has some experience. Everyone has learned something and transformed something in their lives. But the reality is we occupy all three at the same time. So we're working to strengthen the hall of learning, to strengthen the practice and the application of that so that we can transform more of our ignorance into wisdom. Okay, so a final element that is key to developing confidence according to Tibetan Buddhism is a virtue that they call kshanti, which is patience, a whole subject in itself. Fascinating quality, very closely related to confidence because it is in a way a form of faith or trust that things will develop in their own good time. But we have to continue to put in the work for those things to happen. We make the mistake often of thinking that patience is something passive. It's a passive waiting, and all we need to do to be patient is to control our anxiety while we're waiting. But the truth is that patience is the ability to actively work towards something with a vision of where we're going and how we're going to get there. The challenge is that the poor grasping mind wants the result. I've done the thing, where's my prize? And our society today has really cultivated a strong, I would say, culture of impatience driven by convenience. We don't have a lot of patience for things. We want it now, and we want it with little to no effort. So that doesn't help for us to develop our own sense of patience, because it doesn't breed confidence. It really only breeds a sense of entitlement that leads to a lot of frustration. Having confidence in ourselves is knowing that we're going in the direction we've chosen and that we'll get there as long as we keep doing what we need to do. What that means is that we have to give up a little bit the expectations of the result, because that's the challenge. We're very attached to the outcome, how we perceive it to be, what we want, what we desire, what we expect. We need to let go of the expectations. Imagine a gardener that plants a seed but doesn't trust that nature will run its course. So he gets frustrated, he gets impatient, he gets angry at the seed. Why aren't you a tree yet? Doesn't make sense. Nature is a great teacher really for everything, but patience is a good example, because observe how nature patiently takes care of everything. There's no rush, and yet everything gets done. Now imagine that you are that seed and that gardener. You've taken time to carefully plant something, a potential, something that you want to see grow, and then trust that you've done and you will continue to do everything that you need to see that seed grow. But then you have to do it. You have to follow up with what is necessary to do, because patience is not wishful thinking. It's not assuming that, that's it, I've taken an action, nature will take care of the rest. No, because even after you plant the seed, you have to water it, you have to make sure the birds don't get at it, you have to continue to nurture it and play your part. So confidence is not about control, but about participating in nature running its course. Confidence then gives us that certainty that things will unfold naturally in their own time. Will the seed grow exactly as I wanted? Maybe not. Maybe my expectations were a little off. Maybe I planted the wrong seed, or it was the wrong time of year. But based on the results, then I can learn. I can incorporate that learning into my experience and do it differently next time. But if I want everything to grow now, my way, and only my way, then of course, frustrated. I'll be very frustrated and anxious through the process. So this impatience really is a fragility that's underlying a lot of our lack of self-confidence, because we don't trust that things are going to work out, at least not according to our expectations. So we need to work on modifying our expectations, or projecting less desires in our expectations. Be a little bit more neutral, not to expect it to go a particular way. I can have hopes, I can have dreams, I can want things, but to not be so attached to that expected result. Or we're impatient because we don't know where we're going or how to get there. And then everything creates impatience and frustration. So to circle back to where we started, our values help us have that sense of direction. If I know who I am a little bit, I can have some confidence in the direction that I've chosen, that the steps that I'm taking are the best for me now at this point in my life. These values, principles, they become the basis then of my convictions. And I live authentically when I act according to those convictions. And then patiently, I continue to live according to those convictions, trusting that I have the inner ability to learn from my experiences and continue to grow. None of this is a formula. This isn't a box ticking exercise. It's a methodology of practice which has nothing to do with external means. Our confidence comes from the relationship we have with our own mind. And here I use mind with a capital M, as the Buddhists describe Rigpa. The consciousness, the spirit, the inner being, whatever you prefer to call it. There lies our identity. And identity breeds confidence. Confidence enables us then to be in the world. And anyone can practice this method. There's no hindrance. All that's required really is the first step, I suppose, is a bit of daring. We have to dare to be, because naturally expressing our values in the world will change things. It'll put us perhaps in conflict with our own ideas, with others' ideas. There's a little bit of courage to be ourselves because we have to confront ourselves. We have to face ourselves. And because we are a mystery to ourselves, there's a little bit the fear of the unknown. But with that first step of courage, we can transform bit by bit our opinions, our ignorance, into a basis of conviction that gives us confidence. Not to just accumulate intellectual knowledge, but to truly learn and transform, progressively shedding our relative opinions and developing these convictions about what kind of person I am, what kind of person do I want to be, what kind of world do I want to live in.